Okay, I think we're making a start for day 2, session 1 of Humans of the Institution here at the Wiem Theatre in Amsterdam as part of the Amsterdam Art Weekend. And just as yesterday we had some really thoughtful and generous words from the director of the Wiem Theatre, Anna Breuer, this morning we will open with some words of welcome from one of our other local partners, the Dutch Art Institute. So I'd like to hand the microphone to Gabrielle Slijpen for the first words of the day.
Thank you so much, Vivian. I'm not sure if my words are going to be thoughtful, but I wanted to start with thanking you and Anna for putting this up, organizing this in this quite impressive and warm and really encouraging way, encouraging our conversations. As Vivian said, I'm the director of the Dutch Art Institute. Very recently we have decided to say farewell to bricks and walls and leave the premises of our school, which has been based in Arnhem, the East Netherlands, for a long time. Actually, it was not in our plans to come to Amsterdam immediately, because that has been one of the places for very long that we have not been wishing to team up with so much or to go to, because the idea of our school is very much to be aware of the fact that we are in the east of the Netherlands, and tiny as the Netherlands may be, that still means something in terms of a cultural agenda, political agenda. The West in the Netherlands is really the place where culture is being promoted, financed, funded, and working, and the East is always considered as a more problematic domain. From there, we have been working for many years and connecting to many other institutions and individuals all over the world. And now we have sort of radicalized that step and are traveling always. What you're seeing is actually a piece of cloth that has been part of our school for many years. It's very heavy. It comes from Egypt, and actually it was a present we got in Libya, where we have been a long time ago. And it is used in North Africa for wedding parties, and you create spaces with the piece of cloth. It's too heavy to carry it with us every time, so we have it now in a digital way with us. We bring it to the space that welcomes us, the people that welcome us. We team up in the format of what we call the roaming assembly, joining and taking part in the conversations with others, organized by others or with others, together with others. Today we will have Bassam Al-Baroni, one of our tutors yesterday. Rachel was engaging and presenting to you. We have also our students who are working around this conference, which is our model of working, to bring the school and organize our classes, because our students only come for a week per month, and organize the classes around a space like this where many people are gathered. So today a group of our students will work with Sabina Sabolovic from WHW in another space. Tomorrow they will present their work to some of the guests of the conference. We are very happy that there is this mutuality and exchange also for students to take the floor as well. Many of the topics that are at stake here are, of course, completely actual and relevant in the space of education. We are part of a larger university. That's our umbilical cord, I would say. At the same time, we're continuously trying to team up with people that are in very different, less government-backed systems. Today, we will also bring our local partner from Arnhem, which is a tiny bookshop run by 2 women. You will encounter them in the restaurant. It's a way of making a program that really connects to a variety of economic models, and it's an experiment. I have to say there are many sides to that, also in terms of how we relate to the financial models that are given to us and that are also under threat quite often. But in the same time, we are very happy to see that so many young artists and curators and researchers are still very eager to engage in ways of doing the important and relevant work that lies ahead of all of us and especially of them, and do that under quite some challenges. To end this welcome from the part of the DAI, I would say that, of course, the luxury of a space like this, which is the privilege of Amsterdam, as I was discussing with Anne, to have such wonderful spaces, is still something that we feel very happy that we can be part of. Nevertheless, we're also looking forward to engage with more difficult situations as we feel that this privilege is really a privilege, and we should all be open to think how it can be taught otherwise, so that culture is not only something that happens in the art weekend in Amsterdam. Okay, thank you.
And so yesterday in the morning, I went through a fairly detailed list of all of the institutions that it was necessary to thank very sincerely. And this morning, I'd like to list some of the humans who've been really amazing. And I have to say that my life, which is now 7 years long in the Netherlands, really changed a couple of years ago when two things happened. The first was that thanks to the leadership of an artist from Australia, Richard Bell, I finally realized, it finally dawned upon me that there's a completely coherent and powerful civil rights movement taking place in the Netherlands. And that was the first stage of putting my feet on the ground here in some ways. The second stage was discovering that it's entirely possible to put together an absolutely sharp and deadly team out of young Dutch women. And so I need to thank some people who've been working extremely hard and doing an incredible job over almost a year now in terms of putting the program together. So first of all, project manager Lua Vollard. The coordinator Lian van Schaak. I don't know if I pronounced that at all remotely. The general manager for Frontier Imaginaries, Emily van Heijdoorn, is also here somewhere. From the University of Bergen Curatorial Program, the working group's organizer, Rose Kiptoom, as well. Particularly important has been the work of also University of Bergen students who've been participating, Tatiana Lozano and Hans-Lennart Wiesenaar, who did all of these grids on the floor that we see. And from the Veeam team, of course, we saw Anna yesterday, but also Marta van Meegen, Pablo Fontevilla, Jasper Hopman, who's here, and Andrea Rogolino, excuse my pronunciation. Up in the live stream booth, we also have Simon Brandseth, Antus Myron, Preben Soli, and Magnus Ellingsgaard Overli. Apologies again for my pronunciation. Thanks, guys. Anna, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Can I sit, please? Is that all right? Sorry to turn my back to some people. Standing yesterday took its toll. First of all, I would like to revisit Rose, who sits over by Jasper in the booth there. She is, of course, the organizer of all our working groups, and many of you are conveners in the room, many of you are participants to the working groups, but some of you might not have signed up for a working group. If you want to, you will have to do that before lunch today. And we will repeat our little experiment with having a bit of a break and a breather after the talks. So please go and visit Rose if you have a particular working group you'd like to take part in. Some of them are full, but she'll be helping you out. So today I wanted to start also with revisiting what I brought forward yesterday, which is the report from the Norwegian Association of Curators, which is called the Curators' Working Conditions and Their Employers, which will, as I also said, be the basis of one of the working groups on Monday. So starting with a few facts, 92% of the institutions who responded has used the service of freelance curators between 2012 and 2016. And this is, of course, in the Norwegian context. While 46% of the curators who responded has accepted to work without remuneration over the last 5 years, which also echoes what Katja told us yesterday towards the end of the day. And because of the idiosyncrasy of curators' production, there is a misunderstanding about how also their working conditions are idiosyncratic. And I think this is something that we started getting close to yesterday, and that we'll probably circle more around today. Individual, civil, and social rights are threatened, and to all of you in this room, that statement means different things depending on where you live. And as we also pointed out yesterday, that many of you will see, is that we have a remarkably international room, so there are many ideas and experiences to bring forward also today. So today we're taking the word precarious. If we could have maybe the slide of the title of the day. Today's program is called Precarious Practices, and we're taking that as a starting point, the word precarious. And this has perhaps been the defining term for a freelancer. However, when looking at how to address that term in relation to the freelancer, we think it's equally useful and important to apply it to institutions of today. So based on our thinking from yesterday, which just magically happened to kind of lean towards today's thematic, we'll launch into 3 talks that can help us look at the roles of curators to acknowledge the power of the social fabric that weaves us together. Freelancers, museums, artist-run spaces, individual artists, curators, and directors are internetworked. And maybe it's time to differentiate and make visible the different architectures of these networks of the art world, which has adapted itself very eloquently to our times and our network culture. As our keynote speaker of the day, Tiziana Taranova, says, the network culture is a method that privileges process over structure, non-linear processes over linear ones. And this global culture influences the freelancer in a direct way, and to some extent has defined the curator's understanding of self over the last decade. And we'll continue with introducing Antonia, who I believe is behind me. Yes, there you are. Vivian, do you want to introduce Antonia?
I'm also going to sit down, if that's okay.
We're getting lazy.
It's 10 a.m. after all. So I've been given the task of segueing from precarious practices to Antonia Mayaka, and I thought briefly what I might in fact do is to recap from some of the thoughts of yesterday, because at the end of the day there certainly was a momentum in the conversation, and it would be nice to continue that forward. So some of the things that I learned or came to a stronger awareness of yesterday through the conversation was an important point about the complexity of what conditions on the ground means within a global era, but one that also has a long history. And that could be the complexity of, let's say, detention centres offshore being part of the conditions on the ground for the Biennale of Sydney. That could be a tobacco plantation in Sumatra being the conditions of the ground for a museum in Eindhoven. Or it could also be the case of the impossibility itself of a museum in Ramallah that exists to a certain extent to evidence a non-existent sovereign identity outside of that territory. Another point that seemed extremely strong and resonant in the room was the notion of an infrastructure of people that was brought forward and very richly detailed in the presentation on the Anti-Privatization Forum in Johannesburg. However, of course, what does an infrastructure of people mean in practice, where, as Despina indicated to us, this can be a source of accumulation and extraction, as she detailed the risk of Athens being identified as a site of energy and creativity when in fact it's in crisis. Rachel also, with the paper with Danny Butt, indicated how the curatorial trope of managerialism is often implied in the capacity to ignore or to cut off from what those greater structural conditions are. So there's a number of themes between those, but I mean, I think Lara Khaledi's point of a condition of impossibility is something that seems to resonate across it. There seems to be a number of paradoxes that are unresolvable double binds. And so within such a situation, there is only one recourse, and that is to magic. And to the casting of spells or to the reinscribing of conditions, which I think is the perfect introduction to Antonia Miyaka. There's been a certain joke that perhaps if there were to be a next edition, that it would be called Witches of the Institution. I think she is the perfect person to maybe begin to carry that idea with her paper Against Curating as Endorsing. Thank you, Antonia.
Something like this? Can you hear? Yeah. And closer to the tom-tom drums. I was debating which of these stages I should take, and I was thinking, you know, Rachel is so lean and tall, and she can precariously balance on that little chair, but I'm more comfortable here. So, anyways, thank you for being here at the crack of dawn. I'm not actually a morning speaker, but I'm going to give my best. What I'm going to be saying is something that I already presented in a more condensed version in a couple of different occasions, but it's a kind of a text in progress, and I hope to have it in a more structured and final form next year, also published. So bear with me a little bit. And I don't have it written, I have it in different notes, but I did write a small short chapter, which would be one of my two preambles to what I'm going to say, or what I'm going to share with you basically today as a maybe kind of a soft incipiency into a conversation that can follow. So maybe we start with the video first. I just found last night this video, which I thought was great.
Saviour, previous in the collections of three kings of England: King Charles I, King Charles II, and King James II. At 120, not yours. Do you want 130? 240 million is the bid, ladies and gentlemen. I'm selling at 240 million. 302 million is bid. 302. 35 would be next, please. All done. At 315, a shake of the head, no? Okay. What would you like? 318? Gentlemen. 400. 400 million. Loic and Francois, it is with Alex Rotter at 400 million. Leonardo Salvatore Mundi selling here at Christie's. $400 million is the bid, and the piece is sold. So
I was thinking, what can be further from this context than the Christie's auction, where a painting basically representing a white guy with a crystal globe is being sold for $400 million, right? So that's very far away from us, but that I think also makes sense to bring, you know, into a horizon of what we're talking about today. So bear that in mind, just the kind of the iconographic moment. Of course, you know, it's a painting by a Leonardo, but it's also a painting by a Renaissance guy, of another guy, as I said, who is in this case presented as very white and blonde, and we know that he was in fact a Palestinian Jew and a political rebel, but that's a different story. So I managed to write something down as a kind of a little, not really a manifesto, because I never operate with this kind of position. Should I now climb? Okay. So now I'm going to have this mic in front of my face. Okay, good. So it could be called curating does not mean endorsing, pontificating, including, or giving voice. And in brackets, on exposing, not exhibiting. Curating, as far as I'm concerned, is not necessarily endorsing. Understanding curating in terms of endorsing, pontificating, and promoting comes from a liberal mindset and the ingrained logic resting on either the figure of omniscient curator cum savior connoisseur, or counts with the curator as the mediator, basically between artists, public institutions, and the market. So the two are, of course, often congruent and reinforce each other in the conditions of global capitalist multicultural optimism. Now, if you're uninterested in curating as one of the above, and to all the above we can also add curating as colonizing, then doing it differently does not simply mean curating as a form of some kind of uncontroversial eulogizing, sentimental endorsement, or non-committal engagement with whatever content, no matter how legitimate it might be, but being based on extensive research that went into it and so on. To curate beyond endorsing is, in fact, at least in my experience, an extremely serious and very often quite a self-torturous experience. And to come up with ways to expose the material that is contested or to be contested means finding a way, I suppose, to show not only the material itself, but also make evident some of the interpretational conundrums and difficulties behind the decision to expose it in the first place. This is, of course, a very precarious cartography, and is also a very, very kind of risky choreography. It means curating as a position that is traversed with contingency, and it's, you know, essentially means a very delicate placement of objects and their shadow in this kind of metastable system, where suddenly they become exposed to one another in completely unexpected encounters. This is a risky work. And this, however, in my opinion, allows for a whole set of, you know, unexpected disidentifications as well, and different kinds of interpretational slippages. One must, of course, be ready to take risks and be prepared for an outright disaster. But I do not see how we can do this otherwise. Art institutions, as you know, have historically had the task of deciding what is valuable and worth keeping for posterity and what not. This is the history of humanities, of all the disciplines within humanities. The Western institutions are, of course, at the same time, institutions of Western capitalism and institutions of bourgeois taste. As such, they are institutions of Western humanism, of enlightenment, and the white male subject of rational choice, crystal globes, consumer sovereignty, and so on. There's no easy way to undermine and work against this seemingly all-pervasive scheme. The scheme in which galleries promote, art institutions pontificate, curators celebrate in different ways, endorse, promote, and so on, and then basically market capitalizes. Exactly because of the entirely normalized persistence of this model, it seems to me that the exhibition must turn into a form of exposure, and also including a kind of a self-exposure, kind of a, you know, openness to certain vulnerability. And therefore, exposing is something that I'm suggesting instead of exhibiting. It's a slight difference, seemingly, but it does mean a commitment to working against the violent, a whole set of violent reductions that happen within Western humanism when it comes to curating, as it lands in curating. The semiotics of morality, the melodramatics of Western psyche, its eternal stare into this godless abyss of capitalist modernity, and so on. So now to say that what we actually deal with is capitalist modernity, we have to figure out, you know, whether we agree on this and how to actually map and understand the contemporaneity, right? Because it seems to us that, you know, it seems to me that it's obvious. It's not that obvious that we agree where we are, no? And probably, this is something that I derived from my conversations with the colleague Luciana Parisi, also a mutual friend with Tiziana, where we try to describe, you know, kind of a couple of essential paradigms of understanding contemporaneity. The first of these, maybe three, could be called the cybernetic paradigm. That means you're like kind of this, hamster in this continuous wheel of liberation and self-exploitation, and you never get out of it. So it's a kind of a, all-encompassing cybernetic environment. The second would be a kind of an ecological, I guess, which would say that, something that maybe appears in the work of Isabel Stengers and so on, which basically say, to put it in a nutshell, that if you act locally, eventually it's gonna, resonate and induce global change, right? And the third would be something that very often is referred to as left accelerationism. So left accelerationism would be an understanding that if we really go very fast and we try to do our best to kind of, speed up the process of capitalism, and then maybe everything just collapses, and there's going to be some kind of a new terrain upon which a new world can be built, right? So this is kind of, I think all three of these paradigms of understanding contemporaneity are equally flawed, because they all rest on this idea that you basically, have this kind of acting rational subject that can in one way or another understand where it is, even if it's kind of included in this kind of ever-turning cybernetic wheel. And, they seemingly propose different ways of mapping some kind of totality of the experience of the world and so on, but they're all resting on this same crystal globe of this understanding of the potential of global glance, of understanding the world, of kind of, being sure and secure and sort of confident of in a sense, mapping this totality. And this is a moment where I always mention one key text that has been continuously referred to and very often inspirational for a lot of events and talks in the art world, which is a Jameson text on cognitive mapping that was actually given as a lecture as the Eastern Europe states of state socialism were collapsing, where Jameson basically invokes a new aesthetico-political project, as he says, in a moment where basically, any kind of Marxist understanding of totality and ways of representing totality seems to be crumbling. I think this is, again, unfortunately, equally flawed attempt to map totality. It is good in its intention, but ultimately it rests on the same crystal globe kind of guy. No matter how much I'm with Jameson in my heart, and his heart is in the right place, and we are on the same side of the barricades and so on. But ultimately, I think we need something else. So this would be kind of the impossible project. And I think that curating in that sense is part of that same narrative of trying to act this confidence, this kind of confidence of being able to map certain totality. And the mapping of totality in such a way also assumes, not questioning the kind of the normalizing infrastructures, including the white cube and the platform, as Charles was saying yesterday, which basically both, repeat this kind of false neutrality, false universalism that the whole story that I'm telling here is resting upon. So this we need to kind of relinquish control or attempt to control and have this kind of eternal overview and all-encompassing overview. And, especially in the conditions where we are now, it seems to be even more difficult to map this totality, because as a wonderful text by Antoinette Rouvroy, some of you might know it, The End of Critique, is great in the respect that it actually talks about what in the age of algorithmic prediction, in the age of this kind of, being flattened into data in this kind of, algorithmic hell flatlands, what do we do there? How do we map? How do we do? How do we kind of make sense? And basically what she's saying is that the fact that the data, what she calls data positivism, data behaviorism, means that it seems that we don't need to construct the truth anymore, that the truth is given because the data is there. You just look at the data. You don't need to make sense of it because the truth is given, it's there, right? So the kind of the cognitive capacity that comes from this type of, data positivism is also one thing that seriously damages our, our cognitive possibility of cognitive mapping and so on, right? So what can we do? I think that the only thing we can do is to kind of not try to map cognitively anymore like that, and to kind of like give up on this idea that we can have this all-encompassing gaze, and that we can always hold this crystal ball, because this is also one of the kind of the vestiges, the crucial vestiges of the post-war kind of liberal consensus that says, basically, we're going to have the kind of the confidence man of the 50s, let's say Americana is a protagonist of this story. And this also is being perpetuated by the figure of the independent curator that maybe has its apotheosis in the 90s. Very often it's, and I'm not generalizing and denouncing easily, but I think that it is fair to say that it very often is the white male independent curator who is in the possession of both this confidence and universal glance. Sorry, I'm drinking, I'm very jet-lagged and dehydrated. This is it's not operating anymore. We can't do anything with it anymore. We just have to let go. And we have to actively fight against this particular character and this particular kind of universalism and the kind of confidence, I guess. And what comes to mind is another wonderful text that is unfortunately not translated into English by Paul Preciado, where he's talking about two kinds of cartographies to bring it back to questions of mapping. So on one hand, you would have what he calls the cartography of the lion. The cartography of the lion is the cartography of basically safe, stable ontologies. It's an identitarian cartography. It's a cartography where things are fixed, where they're not contingent, and it also assumes this universal glance and a possibility of mapping and a certain confidence as well. Whereas on the other hand, she proposes what she calls a bitch cartography, cartography of the bitch, which I very much like because it actually precisely deals with this kind of interstices, with this kind of slippages, with things between, with the kind of fuzzy logic, with the kind of this kind of unruly border space between fixed ontologies, right? Something that is not easily graspable, it's not easily mappable, it's not easily presented, and so on. This is where our curating happens, right? In that particular position and in that particular space, that space of the bitch cartography, so to say. But to come to that, I invoke another metaphor, so to say, which I take from Denise Ferreira da Silva, her beautiful book, Towards the Global Idea of Race, where Denise introduces this idea of the transversal I versus affectable I. She's referring to I as a subject. She's referring to, while speaking about the bodies She calls it no bodies, bodies in the favelas, bodies that do not deserve to be seen, represented, and so on. But I take this as something that has been reworked by Fred Moten in his lecture delivered a couple of years ago, where he takes from Denis' understanding of the difference between the transparent eye, the all-seeing eye, the eye that understands, the eye of the confidence, the universal eye, I would add, versus not the eye of the affect. The affectable eye is not only eye that is the eye that is driven by affect or some kind of irrational, right? It is the eye that is perceived as always being led by the affect, the eye that is easily affectable, the eye that is discredited for not being the transparent universal eye, but being specific. So I think that what we are talking about here is actually something that goes, that moves this curating, not as endorsing, but curating as, I don't know, you'll help me, I guess, in discussion how we can call this kind of curating, that moves between the bitch cartography and the affectable eye. Eye as both the subject and the optical device. Eye that can zoom in, and while it zooms in, the precision of detail is there, but maybe the entire picture disappears. So these are the kind of the propositions that I have for you today. And of course, you know, we are constantly talking about this white male universalism and so on. I think, of course, this needs to be reassessed. That goes without saying. But what would that actually mean? I guess it would mean thinking, first of all, about all of the words that appear in this kind of syntagma, in this kind of, you know, in this kind of, is this an addressable thing? This white male subject of universalism? What is there to dismantle? What is there to build anew? I guess human is the first thing that we need to reassess. And here I am with Reza Negarestani in thinking about the human without humanism necessarily, but that is maybe too harsh. But in any case, human without the vestiges of racial capitalism, racial capitalist humanism. Human without the confidence of enlightenment. Perhaps the human, the same kind of human that has been struck a couple of times by big blows to this kind of narcissism, by, you know, Copernicus, by Darwin, by Freud, all the white guys again. One that said that, well, it's not actually how we thought in relation to the planets and so on. The other one that said, well, the human is not so special, you know, it's also just being created from this, more or less, you know, kind of very earthly material as all other other beings. And then finally, you know, Freud that says, well, we cannot really influence everything, you know, there is this unconscious and it kind of drives us and so on. So maybe these blows were not enough, so we have to do something, I guess, else. But what if we say that as much as, if we agree, that's at least how I see it, that communism never happened, maybe we can think that universal humanism never happened. That what we are living today is some kind of state humanism, which is maybe similar to state socialism, And we are all here to work towards new kind of universal humanism. Thank you. So that's it. Thank you so much. That was a good morning, I would say. We're going to continue with our little system from yesterday, where we'll give you a few minutes to have a breather and think and formulate your questions and comments, and then we'll be back to you in a second. Okay. I don't know why I'm going to have my back to you all day. Okay, let's start. Okay, thank you so much for that talk, presentation, unfolding of things and thoughts. No, I don't like being, this is too frontal. So do you, it's okay. Do you have, sorry, yeah, it's chaotic. You like it? Yeah. I'm happy, thank you. So we're going to launch into questions about the potentiality of being against curating as endorsing. And I really want to hear if there are any thoughts from the floor before we potentially continue a conversation. You were all here yesterday. It's not very... Ah, there you go.
Can I throw it?
Yeah, of course you can.
Hi there. Thank you for that excellent talk. I heard at the end that we would like to move toward a universal humanism, but the talk is titled Against Curating as Endorsing. And so I'm wondering if, in a too simplistic way, if there's a way to re-articulate what the curating is for or toward. Maybe if you could just...
That was my question to you, that we can maybe now
okay.
have a session where we decide, now that we eliminated everything that we don't want curating to be, now we can work towards what we want it to be, right? But you know, you inspired me actually yesterday. We had a talk over lunch, and Rick.
Yep.
And Rick said, well, you know, this is my third curatorial conference in a row, and one thing they all have in common, nobody ever talks about art. And that's why I showed the Leonardo painting in the beginning. Yeah, so I don't have a good answer for you. This was more, I guess speculative would be the word.
But can I kind of pick up on that, because you do introduce a term at the beginning that I wanted to ask you about, which was exposing, not exhibiting, or exposure rather than exhibition.
Yeah.
Can you maybe link that into your endpoint?
Well, I think it's good to support things with some examples for sure. I am a curator after all as well. I'll give you an example, and where I actually used this word as the title of a project. It was just called Exposures. I was invited together with my colleague Ivana Bago to curate a biennial in what is today an independent Republic of Srpska within Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is the only republic at the moment in the middle of Europe that is based on genocide and legitimized through the peace treaty of Dayton in 1995. And then we said, we don't think that Bosnia needs a post or pre-emergency biennial. At that time, everybody was doing emergency biennials. So we said, instead of that, maybe you can give us this cash and we can stay here for 2 years. So we did. And we showed very little, but I'm not saying this is some kind of, some sort of heroic, you know. But it was tough, you know, it was very tough. And we spent a lot of time working with survivors of Omarska camps, with local youth, and so on. And after 2 years of working in Banja Luka and in Bosnia, I was so done with the region, I just had to escape. I was literally sick. And also, you know, at that time, most of our friends and colleagues and comrades in ex-Yugoslavia basically didn't want to have to do anything, didn't want to have anything to do with this project. Because it didn't really fit with this idea that we should always celebrate the Yugoslav socialist experience, non-alignment, self-management by the workers, and so on.
which we all agree, right? But how far can we go by continuously referring to that experience without understanding that it ended up in a genocide? That the working class we are discussing there ended up in a mass grave? That the war served as a means for privatization? So I'm just giving this as an example because understanding all this, we then realize that, you know, we have to also self-expose to a degree and accept that we are very, very, very vulnerable and that we cannot narrate this history that is complex. That is something that Charles Escher discussed yesterday. How do we reassess these positions of certainty? How do we go beyond this confidence man, right? So this is what I mean by exposure. Exposure means not only exposing yourself and your kind of uncertainty and the kind of curating as traversed as by contingency, as I said, but also, you know, being ready for that risk to fail miserably. And as I said, curating as a, you know, again, this sounds very melodramatic and kind of heroic, but it is a self-torturing task in my mind. And some time ago, probably around the time when we finished this project in Bosnia, where we also showed some, you know, what in a different context and in a different exhibition, I would consider to be really bad artworks. And of course, I could also judge myself because I'm partly responsible for some of these works being today very successful in the art market. They are, in fact. I know for a fact. They're really bad. But it was essential to show them there. It was really essential to show them there. And it was tough to show them there. It was really tough. But otherwise, we would never instigate that debate. We would never reach that level of the kind of mutuality of exposure between all of us, including, I don't know, I think audience is such a reactionary category, it should be abolished. But you know, people who came there, who shared this experience with us and so on. Sorry, that was a long monologue. It's always good with long answers. We need you, Vivian. You're supposed to be in this area with the green one. Ah, see, there you go. Whoopee!
Okay.
You can just keep it like that.
Okay. Antonia, thank you so much for this inspiring set of ideas. I also have just a few comments that also maybe are on different points you raised. So on one hand, yes, we have to be against the stability and security of curators on one hand, but in most of curatorial statements that you read, there wouldn't be a claim or there wouldn't be a strong stance you take. There would be rather, I open this for questions. We want to raise this and this question. We want, so very often is what also Malik or Tirdad Zolhait called this identification with power. So you keep your own powers, you know, to navigate, but then you want to be endorsing, inclusive, so you only ask questions and not say, I do it because of, or I want to engage in that and that, right? Mm-hmm. So there is this double bind, I think, of stability, but then maybe fake inclusivity, or I don't know, depends maybe on the case, but this kind of inclusivity. So it's not only, I think on the other side, there is something which is, okay, let me go to my next point. So I had this experience, just to put it very short, you know, of working with Artur Żmijewski, a radical artist that usually exposes people or issues in his work in kind of brutal manner. He used it for curatorial method. Sure. So what he basically, it didn't work through, but what he would love to have done was to expose, for example, right-wing art. That the whole exhibition would be only right-wing art, so everything we would deeply disagree with would be exhibited or exposed in some sense. But if you try to do it in the means we have as curators, it fails at one point. It's almost impossible, because at the end, you also need to take responsibility for whom you are inviting. It's your guest, you know, so how do you deal with this fact that it's your guest, but actually at the end you want just to expose this this state or
I
this
totally
person.
get what you
Yeah.
mean.
So what I wanted to say, maybe, or raise a question also, that, you know, how to use these interregnums, how to follow your logic of exposing, not exhibiting, but also having a stance in why we're actually doing it, you know, and where do we position ourselves while we're doing it, and not only raising questions.
Oh shit, I just forgot the answer to the second question. Yes, well, the first thing you said is more about curatorial rhetorics, right? It's about, I think there is such thing as curatorial rhetorics. It's a terrible thing where we enlight questions, we illuminate, we are like some kind of, you know, torch bearers in the dark cave, you know, just listen, go through the efflux announcements of exhibitions. They're full of illuminating and you're shedding light on and so on. So that certainly, you know, is the question. The question is only how do you differentiate with this kind of nominal insecurity, or what did you refer to, how did you put it, some kind of disidentification from power, while at the same time, you know, obviously pushing some things and kind of, yeah, that has to do with, you know, I wanted to talk more about this, but maybe, I don't know, it's something for some next time. You know, how the famous anti-psychiatry motto says to treat the patients without treating the institution is basically madness, right? So we cannot either treat the artist or curator if the institutions are so fucked up, right? So we have to work around that. And institutions, obviously, and the way they work, as I was saying, by, you know, endorsing, pontificating, canonizing, and so on, they do this job as well, right? So how do you go beyond that? Because this is, you know, to go back to what I was talking about in terms of Denise and Fred's take on affectable I versus transparent I. Institutions they are the transparent I. They are the universal I, right? They do that work. They are this optical device that provides this all-encompassing glaze of confidence, right? And unfortunately, you know, I remember, I think it was you, Charles, who said, well, at one time in Zagreb, we were talking about how the figure of, you know, how did museums become populist, basically? And you were saying how in the 80s there was a lot of money, so the museums had to kind of, you know, justify all this cash that was coming, so they became very popular, and then it was just like a, you know, quick slip into populism. Once they became popular, it was almost there, just a step away from, like, museum being populist. But, you know, this coincides, I think, with this rise of the figure of this independent curator. So now I was involved in a project that looks at the canon of Western modernism at the House of World Cultures, HKW, in Berlin, where we looked into the kind of the resignifications of modernism, so to say, that happened in the period from the 30s to the 50s and 60s. And we looked through the workings and ideologies professed by thinkers, artists, and so on, gathered around a certain organization that is more or less obscure in different contexts, called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. So there's the freedom, this ultimate empty signifier. So, you know, to talk about these institutions and how to kind of work against it, it's a loop. Now I'm going to come back to it. So you have this curator, the confidence man, which I think is the most symptomatic figure of the 90s. It doesn't have to be a white curator to do that. But there's confidence that comes from being formed in the 80s when there was a lot of money and based on the liberal consensus of the 50s. So then when these curators do their assessment of Western canon, what they do, they either annotate that means we have this master narrative of Western modernist canon, let's say, and then we're going to intervene into it by adding. We're going to add a little tapestry from a native Australian artist, or, you know. So that's one way they do it. Then others, especially in Germany, they like to do things with a lot of confidence in what I could maybe call some kind of, you know, they're all obsessed with media ontology. So they do it like some kind of redemptive media, you know. We can narrate the whole history, but, you know, media is going to bring us. So, you know, to go back to your question, these are the operators of this matrix, of this system. You cannot intervene into the canon by repeating it. You cannot criticize the hegemon by using the hegemon's language, at least in my opinion, right? And this is why our exhibition is really ugly, and it's not placed on white walls. It's not a white cube. A friend of mine, Ana Teixeira Pinto, said, "Why does this exhibition look like it's a chicken coop? It's really ugly." I said, "Yeah, it's not stating anything with too much certainty, right?" And it's also the kind of the relations that are being formed are exactly this kind of very, you know, relations of contingency, I guess. So, yeah, something like that, maybe.
There is a comment right there, or are you just, yeah.
I just wanted to connect what you just were talking about then to your point about the project, the 2-year project that was not going to be a biennale. Because when I was speaking yesterday about conditions on the ground, I wish that I'd answered that question in terms of art history, right? Because people think that conditions on the ground are not aesthetic and are not art historical. And I think that example is a perfect example of what the opposite of what I was talking about as globalist irresponsibility towards art history, right? And this is a huge, I mean, if we think about it in terms of, you know, the curation of times and zones of conflict versus conflicts that are temporal, conflicts of time in artistic production, curatorial production, you know, it's more often than not the case that curatorial projects will find out that they go to this contested space. They're able to produce this show faster than the people that feel most responsible to the material, because those people will take the most time to figure out how not to fuck it up. And because it takes too long in the production times that we live in to produce that more difficult, you know, more torturous curatorial labor, the faster person who's less aware of what is at stake in producing that exhibition to the, you know, in a way that does justice to the material at the level of justice, right? You know, the exchange between those two figures is really the conflict of curatorial time, I think. And I mean, you know, what I like about the show and what I still don't, I mean, it's going to take me 4 times to see that show, which is also the Hakeve show, because it's about a kind of constellation of various kinds of conditions on the ground that relating funding to political contestation and to also parallel literacies in politics informing art. And, you know, I mean, to me, this is really the parallax vision in curatorial professionalism in terms of how much time you get given to do the project that is possible in that project time versus your responsibility to the people that haven't been given that time or that money that are experts in the material, right? And this is the only way that I think, you know, the concept of collaboration was coming into my talk yesterday. Like, if you actually can't feel responsible to those people that know more than you about the work that you're mediating, you know, there's a limit to your professionalism in that internationalist or interregional or intercontextual relationship, basically. I was wondering if you could talk more about that, because
I think, Rachel, I love you more every day. You're just brilliant, and it's absolutely what was missing, I think, in my talk, to say that it is a question of time, that it's not event, as you said yesterday as well, and I think this needs to be underlined, you know, from your talk as well, that boycott does not work because it's, you know, it kind of again works with the same logic of state of some kind of exception, emergency, and so on. So what you're saying just super resonates with what I'm saying, including this kind of the parallax view, I guess.
In order to connect, and before we go on to the next speaker, and thank you for just one of the best speaker performances that I've seen in years, Antonia. That was unbelievable. But so a reflection that strikes me is that these are incredibly nuanced, self-reflexive positions, right? They're coming from, I know that you work as a freelancer and actually work in academia in order to be economically viable, and I know that Rachel's more or less in the same world of things, as am I. And also that you're talking about a willingness to go into quite extreme lengths of self-exposure to the degree of getting sick, right? Which I've done also personally. So my curiosity then is, okay, so on the one hand, I mean, so we're talking that it's necessary for folks within the field to sort of move towards those questions and to move towards that state of exposure, right? And my question or wondering is perhaps one of the reasons why many of us in the room are freelancers or independent curators is because that's actually a choice or a priority that has been made, right? So on the one hand, maybe the bigger question going towards the working groups is like, okay, A, how do we insist upon the knowledges that come from that self-exposure being valued and acknowledged? And on the other hand, how do we insist that our colleagues who are in institutions or in funding bodies or whatever become a little bit more freelance?
Yeah, that's brilliant, yeah. Thank you. I think that's a valid point also to bring forward to the next discussion that Bassam El Baroni will take us through. He's a very dear friend. He just finished his PhD, and I think we should give him a round of applause. And the freshly minted doctor. We will wait for you all to turn and twist. Sorry, yes. We do have a microphone. Where did the microphone go? It's right here. No, there you go. Thank you. Sorry. That's number one. That's number one, yes. Sorry. Just clip it into the thing. Can you just do... Sorry. I'll help you, Bassam, don't worry. All right, I'm going to move back a bit. Sorry, it's a bit of walking here. So Bassam, apart from finishing your PhD, which we all know that you've been hard at work and deep in thought to finish, you are a member of the faculty of the Dutch Art Institute. Of course, we're very happy to activate the faculty here. And we're very proud that you'll share a few of your key points from that work, where you challenge our desires to reduce uncertainty based on rationality, and how this can lead to a persuasion of the universal. And in your work, you problematize the democratic majority rule just as much as hardcore neoliberal moves. The talk is called The Post-Agonistic Institution, Art, Democracy, and the Curatorial. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you so much, Vivian, for inviting me. And thanks, everybody, for being here today. So I'm sorry to disappoint you a little bit. I'll be reading from a paper, but I'll try and be as casual as possible. So, in assessing how art discourse has engaged with questions pertaining to democracy in recent decades, we are met with two broad positions: participation, a mirroring of or democracy, or a mimesis of democracy, and implication, a critique or a critiquing of democracy. There are, of course, blurred grounds and shared overlappings. Moreover, there is a variation on the first position, participation, which has been exceptionally popular within the field of art, as well as having impact on social movements. This is the stance outlined and theoretically developed by Chantal Mouffe in her conceptualization of an agonal democracy, or an agonistic pluralism. What this theory has helped engender is the transformation of the position of participation, morphing it into occupation, or the aspiration to occupy institutional frameworks through the radicalization of democracy. So a point I need to make here, before I go any further, is that agonistic pluralism is relevant mainly because it is clear that it is the quintessential conceptual model that the extended field of art has invested in as a way out of the so-called crisis of democracy in relation to the ever expanding neoliberalism. So neoliberalism is manufactured through a set of tactics, policies, and strategies that produce subjects bracketed into competition. It induces laborers to think of themselves not as political beings working in a society and thus capable of collective forms of organizing and solidarity building, but rather as the expression has it, as companies of one. This has had strong consequences on the democratic project and led to the development of theories that since the 80s have been proposing ways of organizing and mobilizing pluralism anew to push back against this tendency. To this end, and within the expanded field, agonism, with its specific set of demands and theoretical moves, responding to the question how to organize and set up a radical pluralism, has been predominant in shaping art practices as well as institutional and curatorial imaginaries. So investigating it is not to give it more importance or power than it already has, or merely to critique it, but to use it as a platform to reconsider how we might approach the crisis of democracy and the promise of pluralism from a different angle. So, Mouffe often refers to democratic designs, a terminology she leaves underdefined. One can see her theory as exactly that, a design which is to say an organizational model or form for the activation of pluralist liberal democracy against neoliberal hegemony. We can therefore understand democratic design, that term, as the construction of a model for pluralism in the sense of a formula, blueprint, or set of protocols, highlighting what should and should not be taken up in order to induce changes into already existing liberal democracy. This raises the question, what adopting this particular design for furthering democracy against this erosion by neoliberalism has fostered in art discourse, and what kind of institutional... So there are certain characteristics that Mouffe develops in her discourse, and that we can say are characteristics of agonal democracy in general. One such characteristic I call the institutionalization of incommensurability, which is, as I define it, a fixation with the supposed political productivity of considering subjects as agents incapable of being measured together. Incommensurability, coming to us originally from mathematics, has the meaning of two things that are incapable of being measured together. So the institution of incommensurability kind of parachutes that onto subjectivity and makes it an institutional model. So agonism sees the chief ingredient and guarantor of pluralist democracy as well as what constitutes its specificity. Instead of arguing for a rational consensus, it argues for a conflictual consensus that avoids falling into pure antagonism by reinventing conflict as a struggle between adversaries rather than a struggle between enemies. This is to circumvent Jürgen Habermas's deliberative democracy model, which Mouffe sees as bent on achieving consensus to the detriment of pluralism. So a question for the art institution to engage with today is how to think of and apply models for pluralism that are neither agonistic in the Mouffian sense, nor bound to the withering ideals of the public sphere in the mold of Habermas. A point we can make here is that within the sphere of art, agonism has often been championed and adopted because it is seen as a bulwark against the seemingly more rationalistic Habermasian schema of or for a public sphere. But there is doubt as to whether the gulf between Mouffe and Habermas is all that wide in the first place, and not merely exaggerated by Mouffe for the purpose of theoretical efficacy. In fact, this exaggeration, whereby the agonistic is dramatically pitted against the rational, and this is actually a thematic throughout curating. Rationalism is always a problem, and there's always this kind of dramatic pitting, as if like our kind of debates and discussions don't have the rational embedded within them. And I think this is highly problematic and something that curatorial discourse should get rid of in general, kind of this particular formulation. So whereby the agonistic is dramatically pitted against the rational is inherent to the wider modern conceptual framework of agonism and is at the heart of its contradictions. There's a strong contradiction between fundamentally defending the agonistic dimension of politics while at the same time striving to eliminate violence. In the words of political theorist Murat Inci, quote, agonists on the one hand attribute a core founding meaning to power and conflict relations, but on the other hand, in order to eliminate violent forms, contents that these relations may involve, they refer to reasoning, which is essentially in conflict with their original ontopolitical assumptions. So furthermore, the insistence on ascribing such high political stakes, such as the radicalization of democracy and the formation of counter-hegemony against neoliberalism, to a strictly anti-consensus, conflictual form of politics, means that the norms of minimal common reason are constantly undermined. And as Inci suggests, in fact, it is impossible to establish a democracy without such norms. To imply otherwise is to express a skeptical outlook on the democratic project, which is the complete opposite of what agonists like Mouffe entertain, since, as Inci puts it, for agonists, liberal democracy is the heritage to care for. So what I'm trying to do is question if this liberal democracy is the heritage to care for, especially for everybody on this planet. So there is a strange kind of disavowal of the dimension of rationalism in agonistic pluralism, since it is itself heavily indebted to the rationalization process. In fact, we can actually see that it has a lot of the same characteristics that Jürgen Habermas's supposedly opposite contesting version of what a public sphere could be actually is, which is we can identify as critical republicanism. Not republicanism as in the Republican Party, but republicanism as in a republic, meaning a kind of stance whereby there's an emphasis on the supposed constructive role of conflict, and in Mouffe's case, conflict alone, in a parliamentary democracy. What is important to consider here is how these two assumed opposite understandings of a public sphere are both anchored to what is essentially the same space, a parliament. A general public sphere, for Mouffe, is, quote, where conflicting points of view are confronted without any possibility of final reconciliation, quote. So these points of view are also hegemonic projects or latent hegemonies, since for Mouffe, public space can only be conceived as a perpetual battleground. Unmistakably, this is the parliament as an endless battlefield, and this calls into question art's love affair with the agonistic model, since what adopting it as an institutional template leads to is a corresponding one-to-one relationship in which the art institution is conceptualized as a kind of mock permanent battleground that mirrors the parliament as supposed site of neoliberalism's contestation. Simply put, agonistic art institutions, whether in theory or in practice, reproduce the limitations of parliamentarianism and retain as well as internalize the concrete space of the liberal democratic parliament as a kind of imprint or inner image, whatever they do and wherever they go. This is the mimesis in art of a critical republicanism or an agonistic parliamentary pluralism. So one of the other main points that we can see in the agonistic model is this notion of what I call the ontological entrapment of agonistic pluralism. So agonism replaces the idea of a public good with politics itself as an abstract value deprived of any content, except for the pragmatic virtues of pluralism and tolerance. So any notion of public good is kind of disallowed because that is seen as a kind of question of morals. So that's completely eliminated. So politics itself is the only thing that's allowed to kind of be practiced, and politics is here understood as contestation and as conflict. So as a complex maneuver of substitutional swapping, agonism opens up the possibility of immanent critique for all groups in society, left, right, aliens, that are able to identify with this political opportunity and make use of it. However, this opportunity comes at the cost of a kind of ontological entrapment. This is because agonism denies the possibility or the desirability of citizens being able to free themselves from their attachment to social groups, subsidiary to the larger political community, or whose borders overflow those of the polis. In agonism, we're kind of tied, we're chained to our supposed identities, be them local identities, religious identities, whatever kind of affiliations we're supposed to be tied to. So it is because of this that the agonist trap only allows us to articulate a distinctive political virtue in terms of the value of political conflict itself. It is in this sense that agonism allows for a form of participation that resembles something like a universality, albeit a negative one, which can only be accessed through the value of a politics of conflict based on an adversarial ontology of concrete others. And that's Mouffe's term, by the way. So And this is where we can understand how how agonistic pluralism brings its occupational strategy into force. So institutional occupation, as envisioned by agonism, functions through what we may call the franchising of democracy. As an adequate institutional intervention in and of itself. The basic narrative is that democracy has been curtailed and encroached upon by neoliberal bureaucratization, and in light of this, there is a need for establishing a democratic ethos that we can associate with, quote from Mouffe, the mobilization of passions and sentiments, the multiplication of practices, institutions, and language games that provide the conditions of possibility for democratic subjects and democratic forms of willing, unquote. So art and its institutions become sites for this distributed democratic ethos. If we consider the concept of agonism to be the franchiser, what it licenses to the franchisees, in this case artists, practitioners, and arts institutions, is a particular operating method for democracy. The operating method of agonism is licensed to operate as an endpoint in and of itself, as if democracy itself is the goal. Enough. That's what's enough. All we need in the world is more democratization and all our problems will be solved. It won't. That's the argument here. It's not going to solve our main problems. So the operating method so it is in this sense that agonism functions as a franchising of democracy. The value of political conflict as an abstract force upholding pluralist democracy is the only content in the license obtained by the art sphere. Everything else is considered a form of, as form or technicality. So, I mean, there are examples here. I don't want to go too much into examples, but this kind of, we have an example, for example, in the kind of Occupy movements, where for example, the Occupy Museum movement, when it first started at least, the whole idea was to democratize the museum, as if democratizing the museum itself is enough to kind of develop the kind of a discourse around, you know, better rights and a better world. It leaves things open, and that's the main point. You know, the democracy based on this idea of an empty signifier is an empty signifier here. It leaves things open. There's no project that is fulfilled beyond that point of the franchising of democracy itself. So now the point I want to make and to come to is that if we want to think past the mimesis of democracy, its critique, and indeed its occupation as positions the field of art can inhabit, this requires a shift in the organizational sorry, just I think I missed a slide, or no. Right. Okay. The point I want to make is that if thinking past the mimesis of democracy, its critique, and indeed its occupation as positions in the field of art, requires a shift in the organizational concepts and designs we use to generate our responses and interventions. The organizational model that is agonism, as I have been implying, is unlikely to lead us out of the current quandaries of democracy. By designing a model for pluralism, grounded on distinctions such as us, them, constitutive outsides, enemy, adversary, antagonism, agonism, etc., Mouffe provides a simple democratic design that places unreason on too high a pedestal, despite finding ourselves in a political landscape geared towards maximizing an environment of untruth. Rather than our fetishization of the site and object of parliament, we might look to, for example, the late American philosopher Wilfred Sellars' metaphor of a space of reasons, a space that is premised on the common part, with which we can enter into any process of reasoning together without making assumptions about shared meanings, concepts, or beliefs. By banishing this common part, for example, this is what we find in MOVE, the space of reasons, by banishing it in order to radicalize democracy, MOVE also disallows the transformability of subjectivity. And I think this is one major point. It helps endorsing already existing identifications, but it banishes the transformation, the possibility of transformability of subjectivity, which, as I see it, is a main goal and is a main desire. So, as understood from the work of philosopher Johanna Seibt, whoops, okay. Sorry, this is a bit fidgety. Okay. All right, so. Right. As understood from the work of the philosopher Johanna Seibt, the cultivation of the space of reasons, this common part, can be considered a project in its own right. The starting point might be in understanding what dialogue actually is. Looking at it more carefully on both the manifest, the kind of space of language, and the scientific registers. Underlying dialogue, Seibt tells us, is a process of cognitive orientation. So dialogue, in many ways, Seibt tells us, is a bit like when, imagine yourself in a building that you know quite well, but one day you exit this building from an exit you've never exited before. That moment, you're disoriented. You're a little bit kind of taken, you lose your bearings in a way. So that point is a point of cognitive orientation until I find my way again, and then I'm back on track. What happens or should happen in a dialogue when structured properly is actually that particular moment. It's a kind of that transposition of that spatial register of moving around and after being a little bit slightly lost or disoriented. And that's what it needs in order to kind of produce, that's what we need to kind of produce this kind of point of gaining traction on a space of reasons. So Seibt tells us it's a process of cognitive orientation, a mental operation distinct from forms of conversation, from other forms of conversation, in that it is not based on the extraction of information, the development of a plan for action, or the overcoming of an opponent. Like all these things that we usually associate with conversation, it's not in dialogue. But actually, its main and sole purpose is the shared cultivation of the space of reasons as such. So can we think of the curatorial as something that takes that up as a project, begins to think of these democratic designs as in a way that takes that up as a project? So a new democratic design might draw on dialogue, intersubjective reasoning, and the design of models that do not start out from an absolute belief in the conflictual and the concreteness of others. Such a speculative project might be called the post-agonistic institution. This is an institutional practice that would permit an eventual shared understanding, achieved neither by imposing commonalities nor by exploiting incommensurability. Instead of privileging the radicalization of parliamentary democracy, we would be committing ourselves to what James Trafford has called a radical intersubjectivity, whereby in understanding the constraints of structural power, those engaged in a conversation can work to surpass those constraints through dialogue and reasoning. What is required, as Trafford points out, is a vision of reasoning together, which is capable of making claims that are irreducible to current structures of power, yet also not immune from them. Unlike agonistic democracy, such intersubjective practices of reasoning set out to construct new shared perspectives, irreducible to and transformative of our individual perspectives. This is to suggest that reasoning can be thought of as a distinct position, in contrast to the ones already established in the art and democracy debate. This emergent project implies a shift from participation, implication, and occupation to reasoning. Thank you very much.
How are we going time-wise? Are we staying here? We're taking a break? We're speaking? Okay, all right. Sorry, just conferring. In order to keep to time, we're going to immediately go to questions. Oh, no, we're not. We're taking a break? We're not taking a break, but we are speaking among ourselves, briefly. A breather. It's a breather. It's a not break. We're freelancers. We're really good at not taking breaks, right? So I think we're going to start back up again. I feel like I should do a Pina Bausch performance. Thanks, Bassam. Following Anna's lead, are there any questions or thoughts from the audience in the very first instance? Okay, so Bassam, I want to ask a question that's a bit unwieldy, but it must be said that your presentation was ambitious, so maybe I'm meeting it directly. But I mean, I have the impression that this large arc of inquiry is in some ways fueled by a set of disillusionments that you personally hold in the wake of what's called the Arab Spring, right? And as I said, I have this slightly unwieldy question in terms of what some of this has meant in terms of art institutionality within that context, or curating in that context. And I wonder if, a bit like Antonio, you might have an example of how this has played out within your practice or within practices that you've observed within that context.
So before the Arab Spring, in the very first, during the very early kind of events that eventually led to it, I was in the middle of curating Manifesta in Murcia, and I developed a project as part of the exhibition where I invited groups of like different collectives from different parts of the world to kind of have a conversation around like political activism and how art might influence it under certain kind of the constraints that were evident back then in like 2009, 2010. I invited an architect to develop a structure for that particular project, and it was actually an architectural office, and they made this kind of strange set where it was basically like a parliament. Was two sides, hard-edged minimalist, huge thing, where people were basically kind of tortured. They sat all day on these kind of, huge objects, kind of confronting each other, confrontational kind of aspect. And they actually, all of them at the same time, were also kind of interested in agonism, as being the flavor of the day it was back then. The architectural studio loved agonism and made that thing, and basically it created a toxic atmosphere where instead of being able to have a conversation, people were fighting all the time. And that was for me the first realization of thinking about, I think, why do we treasure this idea of conflict as a source of political productivity? But I forgot about this, of course, and the Arab Spring happened, as you say, and then when I started thinking about what I might want to approach in a PhD, I began thinking about wouldn't it be interesting to make an argument for dialogue instead of an argument against dialogue, because one of the, I think the real issues since, I think, post-1968 philosophies in general, right, is the, I would say, the kind of the, there's a huge tendency to bypass any notion of reason in an argument, or reasoning. I prefer to call it reasoning because I think there's a distinction here that's very important. I'm making a distinction between this particular project of reasoning, which is not bound to certain rules and regulations, as in Habermas, for example, that you have to agree on before, but that comes through the inferring between different people in a discussion. It's more open-ended, it can be disastrous, it can end in a fight, but it doesn't start with the intention of kind of conflict, right? And that's the different point of view. So one of the major issues, I think, with like post-1968 philosophies is that they really kind of want to, there's almost like this will of bypassing reasoning in general. So, for example, in the Deleuzian model, the idea is like a strange reason. You see the artwork and you transcend into this kind of transcendental empiricism. You feel this kind of specific kind of thing that then works on the abstractions and so on. In all of these kind of more kind of theories that have to do with direct kind of political debate, the idea is that basically instead of like reason is supplanted with conflict and passions and all that. So I think what I wanted to do is like make an argument for this kind of minimal kind of common reason, which I think is something that we need to kind of, instead of to kind of bash all the time, reclaim, I think, to the left in a way, rather than kind of always think that it's part of the history of a kind of colonialism, which of course it is, but how do we reclaim that? And I think there's a possibility there that can, through kind of trying to reformulate these models, rethink them with our kind of different engagements, with our different contextualities, and imbue them with our different problems, that there's a possibility there that we can actually have some kind of reclamation process.
That's incredibly powerful. I can immediately see that within the structure of our conversation in terms of, maybe an artist could say, yeah, but how can you reason with a curator, no? And then the curator says, yeah, but how can you reason with the museum director? And the museum director says, yeah, but how can you reason with the arts ministry,
Yes.
I think Charles had a question. There's a...
Do you want to throw that? Firstly, thanks a lot, Bassam, and it was quite a lot to take in as well. And I mean, there are many, many things that I agree with you on, absolutely. I suppose what I wanted to do, at my age, to maybe think a little bit about positioning agonism historically for a moment.
Yes.
Because I think I think you're right, but I think you're a little bit unfair to it. And the reason I would say you're unfair to it is because what MOVE was doing at that time, I think, was trying to fight an argument of, or understanding that neoliberalism, the neoliberalism that emerged from Chile in the 70s and took full power after '89, was clearly targeted at the time in the 90s at full spectrum, what we could call full spectrum dominance. In other words, there were times during the Cold War, certainly, but also even within Western capitalist democratic societies where fields, the political, the cultural, the economic, we could say, had certain distinctions. And there were distinctive discourses which were going on around them. And that what happened under neoliberalism was this attempt to have, through the economic imperative, full spectrum dominance over everything.
Yes.
Art institutions also followed that route, and that's what we have from the Tate or from M+, perhaps in Hong Kong. These institutions that claim everything, from being the artist, you know, the artist-run space to being the national story. So that full spectrum dominance was what she was challenging.
Yes.
And she was saying, let's have discourse which is meaningful rather than the parroting of the same ideology within the parliamentary system. Yes. I think what we have to accept is that that battle was lost.
No, absolutely.
It was a failure. Her project was a failure. But it was a failure with a particular historical background. And that's all that I would say. If you then apply it to the conditions now, I understand your argument, but it came out of something else.
No, I totally agree with you. No, I absolutely. I mean, of course.
So she's not so bad.
Beg your pardon?
She's not so bad in that sense.
No. There's no kind of let's say I have a deep appreciation for Moof's work in many ways, because I think she leads the way in kind of this idea of how to compress a kind of model for thinking within a. So I think that she really does that, but I think she does it the wrong way, because what I would argue is that because of that, I mean, of course, I totally agree with what you're saying, but because of that, that encouraging of, you know, kind of unreason all the time has its consequences, right? It has its consequences, and we see its consequences today, right? So it's it's part of, you know, when you're thinking of how to kind of intervene into a situation, that intervention can have negative or positive consequences. So I think,
I mean, for me, you're pointing out very clearly the failure of that project. So so we can also call it historically,
yes,
but not necessarily call up its ghost today,
right?
Because it seems to me that, I mean, what's clearly happened is that any kind of reasoned discourse has moved to an extra parliamentary condition. We can see that from Podemos, see that from the Occupy movement, these various things. They've not been able to find a space within that architecture of the parliament.
But I think they're quite influenced by Moofian ideas too.
But I think that she was really trying to argue for a democratic civil space, which I'm saying I don't think exists anymore. I mean, we do not live in democracies anymore.
Yes.
And the fact that everything is outside, or at least in parliamentary democracies, the parliamentary democracy does not exist in any form which we can recognize. It's, we were just talking about Hong Kong. It's a set of appearances. It's a set of maneuvers which we go through, elections, you know, absurd processes which we invest time and energy in, all of us, which produce outcomes which are already predetermined. So that's not anything like a parliamentary democracy. So that, sorry, should I shut up?
Yeah, no. We have a comment from the.
Okay, there's a green cube over there.
Marina.
Can I come back to you? Okay.
Am I speaking into the? Okay. I'm not going to ask a question about MOVE because I have.
Hold on, underneath.
This? Yeah. I'm not going to ask a question about MOVE because I'm not invested in rehabilitating her right now. But I was going to just ask maybe more of a clarification type question. In the beginning, you mentioned two tendencies. The one about implication. Could you say a bit more about that?
Thanks, Marina. I think, like, generally speaking, implication, for example, is invested in de-idealizing democracy. It's invested in implying the audience in this process of in the process of de-idealization of democracy. So, for example, the work of Thomas Hirschhorn, you know, his famous works like Swiss Democracy, or the works after that deal with, you know, war and the image of war, and as a kind of consequence, like, you know, wars made in the name of democracy. So that's the kind of domain. Of course, participation is kind of participation with its relational aesthetics and all the kind of, counter arguments and the whole discourse around it. So, yeah, that's what I was trying to kind of get at there.
That's a question from Natasha.
Yes.
Bassam, I would be grateful if you could connect more the post-agonistic and this reasoning method to your own exhibitions, really, which some of us have been also reading about for years and seen a few. I mean, like even when you deal with something like agitationism, or I'm just wondering if you could play the curator just for a bit and answer some of these.
Well, no, I don't think I've made an exhibition yet that kind of encapsulates or tries to kind of get at that in a way. And I'm not even quite sure if it is kind of something that's exhibitionable. I think it might be something that that is more related to kind of developing research and working with people on long-term projects structured around these ideas. But I'm a bit skeptical that it is something that leads to an exhibition.
We have a question from Mac.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for this.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm wondering how you think about arriving to the shared sense of reason in a world where we have so few even shared facts anymore, in an era of post-truth.
Yes.
And this sort of data positivism that was talked about earlier.
No, I mean, I don't know how I think about it, but I know that this is precisely why we need it, in a sense, right? This is precisely why there needs to be some kind of thinking around why this might be necessary, because of that kind of environment we find ourselves in. But yeah, I mean, I find also the notion of post-truth, of course, it's highly exaggerated in many ways, right? It's I find lots of people kind of really fascinated by it as a territory, and there is some kind of, I think there's a strange, within the art field, I find there's a strange kind of love-hate relationship with this notion. Like it's almost as if, post-truth, the horror of post-truth, but also there's a kind of like internal kind of like, oh, but I love it because now I can do anything kind of thing. I think it plays into a lot of the kind of narratives in contemporary practices where the notion of truth itself has been completely evacuated, you know. So I think it's a problematic concept that I wouldn't actually like to kind of endorse or kind of, you know, play into its narrative, but rather just ignore and kind of continue it, because I think eventually it'll fade away. It's something that we won't have for very long as a kind of conceptual grounding.
We have a question from Aaron.
Yeah, I just want, maybe I take it from the opposite end of
Yes.
Charles. Instead of talking about agonism, I'm really interested in your defense, passionate defense, I would say, of reason.
Yes.
And I feel kind of solidary with this.
Thank you so much.
Although, you know, in this context and in the art context, I mean, there is something very controversial, because for you, if I understand correctly, like, reason is not part of an antagonism. Like, reason is not an agonistic position, but reason is a universal position, so it transcends the agonistic field. And you refer to authors like Sellers, The Common Space of Reasons. I guess the little twist I would like to add into this is if you want to reconstruct this through the history.
Can I say something? Yeah. Just to kind of, it doesn't transcend antagonism. I think this is also because of the kind of compression of this is this is not clear in the present. It doesn't transcend antagonism. That's really important. It transcends agonism, which I think is like a manufactured concept, right? But antagonism is the political, and I totally agree with Moof on that in many ways. So, but I don't think antagonism is outside of reasoning. It's
okay,
part
but this
of it,
is the point I would come to. I mean, I guess you couldn't fall into a position where you say reason is just white man's reason, for instance. Like reason doesn't just express a particular sort of hegemonic point of view. It's not just an ideological term, but it has a critical value. That's what I take from your presentation.
Yes, no.
But then if you want to reconstruct that through the history of like post-68 philosophy, I mean, I would kind of disagree with your characterization of Deleuze, but I think the real kind of interesting author there, who was kind of against the grain of the time, of course, was Lacan, who explicitly said, you know, my project is situated within the Enlightenment, and Freud is a rationalist. But if you start from something like that, then you realize that reason doesn't necessarily mean that we all have to share like a space of reason with certain inherent norms, like Sellers would argue, like, as you say, where we share a common part. I would almost prefer like a more paradoxical expression, like we unshare a common part or we share an uncommon part. This would maybe be closer to like a psychoanalytic understanding that to enter into reason also means you can have something like an unconscious, like something you can't simply explicitate via a kind of reflection on your presuppositions, which is the kind of horizon of dialogue. And I also think, I mean, so this would be a much longer conversation, but you know, a lot of encounters with art is closer to the weirdness of a psychoanalytic encounter, where it's not exactly a dialogue, but it's not outside of reason either. So I'm a little suspicious of the notion, you see, that's where I would press you a little bit on the defensive dialogue. On the other hand, just to finish, I am, as we were saying, like between us, if you just read Habermas today very naively, I mean, forget 3 decades of critique, you know, my reaction is that would be nice if there was a little bit more commitment to some basic communicative norms in public space. So on some level, I understand, you know, where your reaction is coming from. The rehabilitating the notion of reason today is really crazy, radical, and subversive.
I think we have an amazing conversation which would be called a Mufi and a Lacanian and an Egyptian curator meet in a bar. And we could make a Sunday afternoon arts program and it would be terrific. Bassam, do you have some final words and then we really must press on?
No. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Great. Well, it's been a really lively and really engaged morning, which is obviously a miracle, given that it's, you know, a rainy winter Sunday morning. So magic can happen already, we've seen. It's now my task to introduce the keynote speaker for today, which, as Anna mentioned yesterday, we've invited each day somebody who's outside of this strange, obscure domain of contemporary art and of curating, to remind us of the meta structures that we are occupying and inhabiting. Of course, please be welcome to adjust your seating. So, I must admit, so it's been presaged to a certain extent in the conversation on truth, but also in Tonya's reference to data positivism, that there, without doubt, has been a kind of an industrial revolution within networked and digital technology that has been affecting the structures that both freelancers and the institutions of the 20th century and of industrial modernity are occupying. And both the individual as a freelancer and the institutions of Enlightenment modernity are displaced somewhat within this broader economic shift. I must acknowledge that personally I shy away from what tends to be often a kind of a digital positivist boosterism in terms of this being the most important shift of our time, etc. Not least because of the kind of aesthetic claims that it actually permits in our field towards some kind of post-internet aesthetics, which to my eyes so often tends to be a reason to be interested in what guys in New York or guys in London are thinking again, you know? So like in the 60s, like guys in New York and London could like take acid and feel, you know, a bit phenomenological and push over a column, and that was interesting. And now it's like guys in New York and London are like, I'm on the internet and I kind of feel alienated, and there's a video of me talking, you know. So for me, still, the most important differences are the early modern differences of, you know, the racial, the female, and the prior folded within the natural. Nonetheless, I think this technological difference massively intensifies that structure. And therefore, in order to seriously and pragmatically be talking about organizing, it is necessary to engage with what's going on and with what its mechanisms are. In that interest, one of the thinkers whose work I most tend to follow is Tiziana Terranova, who I'm extremely happy that we have with us. She has a book forthcoming that, if I get the impression, I think is going to really be revealing something like a social network theory of value, which I think will be just an incredibly useful, critical tool to have within our pockets. So without further ado, I welcome the keynote from Tiziana. Thank you for sharing your research with us today.
Thank you very much, Vivian and Anne, for this opportunity to be with you. I really enjoyed the last 2 days. It's very nice to be coming into another world, really, because I never really had much contact with the world of curating and curators. And so we had to talk quite a lot. I mean, we had a Skype conversation when they asked me to come, and it was about me trying to understand what I had to offer. So that was really useful, and that's when I decided I was not going to write a paper. That since this was what was important was the kind of the world I was entering and the kind of concerns of this world. I was going to just spend the first day. I was lucky to be placed on the second day, just listening and seeing, you know, what I can do, what I can share with you of this research I'm doing about, which is going to come out in a new book, but which has been nourished really by engagements with all kinds of collectives over the past 5 years, both local, national, and transnational. So thanks again for inviting me, and I'm also really admired the way this room has been, the kind of setting, the conference setting. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to say something about it as well later, how social network theory would think about this space. Okay, so yesterday I listened and listened. I come from a kind of new media theory background, so I studied the internet since the 90s, and I wrote a book about it in the mid-2000s, and since then, you know, this has been my chosen field of research. So I came here yesterday, and I realized that this was a meeting of mostly freelance curators, which I was kind of aware before, but I didn't know what it really meant until yesterday. And I was thinking, you know, what can I say that is relevant again, you know, to a group of freelance curators? And then I heard you talking, and you were talking, and you were using words. You were talking about networks and platforms, creating networks, connecting networks, sharing. Now, okay, that's a post-truth. So your language returned me concepts and categories that I've been working on in my attempt to kind of find a different perspective on what Geert Lovink here in Amsterdam has called the cultural logic of social media, or what is called this kind of social cybernetics, which is emerging out of the rise of social media since the mid-2000. So your language of forming networks, connecting, sharing, following, yeah, platforms is already full of this social media language. To witness that it's not something that is just contained in a media sphere, but it's something which has really permeated all areas of what used to be known as society. And the one thing that I figured out, and I had to figure it out myself because, you know, it wasn't so easy to discriminate, was that networks are not the same thing as social networks. And I've been studying networks for my early work, so I studied computer networks, I studied the way in which they conceive of space, the conception of heterogeneous machines connected by common protocols. And the social was not so foregrounded because it looked like, you know, okay, it was a social process, that of assembling the internet. There was no doubt about that. So, but the social was not a term that, you know, was problematized by the early internet. And then after the takeoff of social networking sites and social media in the mid-2000s, especially from 2006 and 2007, all of a sudden it was all about social networking services, which then became social media. And again, it took me some time to realize that the social network as a diagram, as a method, as a set of tools, as a concept, as an info visualization, had different trajectories than the networks that I was used to study. A famous German media theorist, that is Friedrich Kittler, argued that networks existed even before they were named, and they existed in the forms of water pipes, water networks, road networks. So again, it was kind of disavowing the social, which is a project of German media theory. So the social is not relevant anymore. It's all about technology. But what I found, again, was that the genealogy of social network theory, the kind of diagram and knowledges that have been incorporated into our media platforms, have a different genealogy which has not been really explored. I mean, it started to be explored. Software theorists and software artists who have worked with social media interfaces, especially looking at the difference between front end and back end, so what the user sees and what goes on behind the interface, have started highlighting that there are models here that have a history and they've been imported, but you know, they're kind of going, kind of really thinking about this convergence of this model is something that has not, you know, been done, and because it is quite difficult, it requires quite a leap. So I started listening. Can we move on? Yes. So this is a short blog post, not so short actually, shortish. Blog post, which I wrote for the blog of the Technoculture Research Unit, which is a collective I started with other PhD graduates at the University of Naples, L'Orientale. We blog mostly in Italian because there's a kind of a gap in that field in Italy, but the article, I translated it myself into English because it was a comment about a Facebook letter published by Mark Zuckerberg on his profile page in February 2017, where he argued that the future of Facebook was the construction of a global community and took responsibility for providing the infrastructure for this global community. So I started kind of looking back at some time ago at the Zuckerberg statements, what was coming out of the social media platforms. And so I found out that a kind of key turning point was 2007. 2007 is the year where Facebook becomes a platform. So it announces that it's no longer just a website, but it's adopting the platform mode. And when it announces a rather nervous 23-year-old Zuckerberg imitating Steve Jobs and being so nervous that the video has been taken off the internet. So you only have the kind of reports in the press. He announced that this website of his and his associate, which was not, you know, people were really skeptical about Facebook to start with. And when I'm saying people, I'm saying the Silicon Valley business investors community. They got burned in 2001, 2000, and they were like, you know, let's see what happens. So he kind of said, look, my company has an asset that nobody else has. The asset that we have is that we have the social graph. We have access to the network of real personal connections that people have. And nobody has that to the extent that we have. Because people enroll, users enroll in our platforms, and they declare their networks. They articulate their networks. So we can reconstruct through our website who is connected to whom. And also, he said, the social graph, so the info visualization, that's a social graph, right? The info visualization of the social network, where each node is an individual connected to other individual, is our infrastructure. So it's our base and infrastructure. It's what lies within Facebook, and this is what, on top of this, we are going to build a platform. It's the core of our platform. So the social networks of articulated connections is our platforms. What he announced at the time was that one of the applications of, the social graph was what made information go viral. Remember that before the web was mostly a collection of documents. Then he went through the kind of web 2.0. So because people pass on things, share things, and things are being passed on. So we have the chance to look at how information goes viral. And we are going to build applications, open up applications. So that's a platform model, which means we put the hardware, we put the protocols in, we put the framework, and then everybody can contribute if they adhere to our standards. And I think that's a connection with the platform model for the institution. We put resources and protocols, and then people can come and build applications that are compatible with what we are doing. And also, he said, we're going to use the social graph to spread information, and we also use it to produce a feed, which was something quite new at the time, the news feed, but which turned up to be a new form of time-based screen media, which is going to build out of everything that is shared on the social graph. And with time, he was arguing, it's going to accelerate to such a level that people are going to acquire kind of social proprioception. Jody didn't contest that, but that's another kind of new media quarrel, which I'll leave on the side. It's going to accelerate, and people are going to feel and going to understand each other a lot better because there's going to be all this sharing that is going on. So that was in the mid-2000s. And since then, the business press was skeptical. They were like, everybody who wants an address book of their users have access to their social graph. Google Mail has access to social graph because they have their contacts. Later, this model will come back through the mobile apps, WhatsApp and so on. They all use your phone numbers as your network of connections. So this was, when this happened, when kind of Facebook started growing and growing and growing, now there are about 2 billion user accounts, not uniformly distributed. So this is the Facebook global, that's a global space that we're talking about, that's Facebook Look, showing how the globe is connected by Facebook and which areas are more connected than others. I would say that this model, again, there was skepticism around it at the time, not in the Silicon Valley, where the idea really took off in 2007. Google launched its own social graph initiative, which was closed later. So what the social graph allowed, in my opinion, and so I kind of give it to you as an input, is they have allowed the formation of a new, or elaboration of a new stage of cybernetic thinking. I think that the first stage, usually the first stage of cybernetic thinking, cybernetics is articulated for the first time in the late 1940s as this idea of the cybernetic organism as an island of order in a sea of chaos. So entropy surrounding the organism from all sides, really World War II kind of product in terms of the imagination. Then you have in the 1970s the second wave cybernetics of Gaia, the self-organizing planet, autopoiesis, energetically open and informationally closed. Then you have, in the 1990s, artificial life with this simulation of emergent system. It's all about self-organization. The models are biological. There are all these programs that simulate selfish entities which are busy imitating and copying their neighbors in order to maximize their survival and evolve in the process. And now I think all this data are generating a new kind, an attempt to refound the project of social physics from the 18th century, 19th century, 18th century. That is the idea that the social, this is the data, positivism that we talked about, that the social can be simulated, studied through these massive data sets in such a way as you can find patterns of behavior, and you can use these patterns of behavior to anticipate change. And kind of, anticipation is key to futures market, to advertising, to marketing. So they are looking for patterns, and you have places like the MIT lab directed by Alex Pentland with his social physics, which is all, again, about showing how you can use big data to refound the social sciences in a positivistic kind of manner. What I'm making of this is that I got this idea, just reading and studying all these documents that are coming out of the adversarial side, maybe Mouffe would say. What I got out of it is that what happened there, what has been happening with this social cybernetic, is that what they've done, they have taken up, incorporated a diagram which had an older history, and the diagram is the social network. They've incorporated it, which means using a technical term, it's been transcoded, which is the transformation of something into a data object. The social network was a diagram which pre-existed social media that's been transcoded in such a way to function as a medium of communication. So you can share things across a social network on the one side, and a medium of computation on the other. You can calculate the social on the other side. So you can do these two operations at the same time. What I find interesting, so I went and I tried to look at where was this model coming from? Because we think that we take it for granted when we talk about social networks and networking. We think that it's something that is kind of always been there. But it's not a universal. It's not something that there's always been social networks, and then at some point scientists discovered that there are social networks. But the process of formulating the concept, and especially the diagram, so the image of the social as a network of individuals, took a long time to elaborate. If you look at history of social network analysis, which is a sociological approach that's been incorporated and modified by this social media platform, what you find, I found a kind of story that took me to places that I was not expecting. It took me to the global space. Antonia and Denise Ferreira da Silva were referring to. If you look at textbooks about social network analysis, some will tell you that the origins of social network analysis are in social anthropology. And particularly, they mentioned the work of British anthropologist Radcliffe Brown. So Radcliffe Brown introduced the concept of the social network in the 1930s, I think, during his studies of Aboriginal communities and native primitive communities in Africa, right? Inverted commas. He was an exponent of a new approach to anthropology, which was trying to displace the old evolutionary anthropology with its emphasis on time and its kind of classification of different societies as being more or less developed, more or less civilized, without really breaking with that. So he broke with that by breaking with the time model, but introduced this spatial model. So he argued that every society And by that, he referred to the affectable eyes that they were studying, of course. The anthropologists were studying all over the world, including in England, but there would be subaltern subjects within England. So it would be small communities, workers, farmers, villages. So his attempt, he said that he wanted to make the invisible structure of the social or society visible. And so the anthropologist should reconstruct the structural forms. He followed Durkheim in this, that there was a social facts, and social structure was a social fact. There were structural forms, and then there were kind of actual structural forms. So you could kind of make a typology of that, and that anthropologists to kind of figure out this invisible structure. So there is got an article called The Structure, it's a functional structuralist approach. So the structure is linked to function. But so within the social network, we found diagrams of a kind of knowledge, which is the knowledge that Da Silva was talking about when she talks about this global space, constituted by transparent eye, which is the anthropologist or the researchers, who goes in the field and tries to get the social structure out by visualizing or imagining somehow these networks. But the interesting thing is that he was not the one who invented the diagram that we saw before. Maybe we can go back. So he was not the one. Is this a screenshot or the actual? Okay, so we cannot scroll. He was not the one who actually came up with this very, very familiar diagram. As Alexander Galloway is right when he says that aesthetically networks are very poor. You know, it's always the same image again and again and again. So the space of mediation is zero in social networks. Because it's in the always in the 1930s, is the other social science they adopted this kind of network model, which came up with this visualization, and that's social psychology. Actually, it was the origin of the graph that Zuckerberg was showing is assembled a crowd of developers and investors. That diagram had been shown before in New York this time, not in San Francisco, in the 1940s, by an Austrian, Jewish, Hungarian emigrant to the United States, who came to the United States through Vienna, where he had become part of the psychoanalytic movement, opposing Freud on the basis of it's an extraordinary character, Giacomo Moreno, on this idea of God, of the Godhead, his model of the Godhead as the creativity of it was kind of this mystical side about him. But anyway, so Moreno came up with this visualization as part of his method, which was part of psychoanalysis but opposed to Freud, because what he worked with was groups. So he believed that groups were more important than kind of working with individuals. So he came out with this info visualization to reconstruct the network, psychological network, psychosocial networks in specific groups. Since then, and before social media, these kind of sociograms, that's how they were called, were produced in a variety of contexts. And the methods are fascinating because some of them are kind of classical, so they're like Facebook before Facebook. So you go to a group of people and ask them, who do you like best? No, who do you think is your best friend? And then out of that, you visualize this map. So, you know, that process had been done by social psychologists before in small groups. But if you look, if you just have a look at some of the famous papers of sociometry and social psychology that use this network, they would even go as far as produce sociometric charts for babies. So how did they do that? Because there would be a psychologist with a bunch of babies, maybe in a kind of nursery room, and then they would say, they would write down, count how often babies would look at each other. You know, which baby would be looked at the most, and which baby would be looked at the least. And then they produced a ranking, if that sounds familiar. You know, it's because it is how even Google's algorithm works. It uses this kind of method. So they produce a ranking of the most popular baby, sociometric star, and they isolate. So there's a whole history behind it of info visualization that use this familiar diagram were produced in all, about all kinds of phenomena that could be translated into a network. So you got, then sociologists came in and they started producing social networks, social diagrams of kind of black communities, migrant communities. You would have sociometric or social network analysis studies of how strikes erupted in factories, where did they start? There is a study that really struck me, which was all about how a factory which was employed mostly women in the 1940s was shut down following an hysterical epidemics. Somebody said they were bitten by a bug and just collapsed to the floor, and then everybody else say, okay, we've been bitten, and there was this kind of, the factory was brought to a halt. So they used that to reconstruct where the contagion had come from. And so what I found looking at this diagram, which has been literally transcoded into the social network, was a much older tradition that has got to do with social psychology, social anthropology, sociology itself, and which takes another turn in the 1960s and 70s when the kind of social diagrams, and this is an intermediary step, which is very important for social media, where social network analysis starts to move from small groups, which is what they've been mapping, to large populations. And these are the studies of Stanley Milgram about the 6 degrees of separation. So the famous study where he tried to see whether a letter could get from one individual in one part of the United States through another which they did not know, by choosing people that they thought might know somebody who might know that person. So it's a quite famous study. Less famous study is the one they produced about the so-called color line in the United States. They produced, the same group produced a study about, through a teacher, through somebody who had some version of authority. In the meanwhile, the info visualization got more, also through the use of computer modeling techniques, developed a set of standards or conventions that we are become very familiar with now. So it was not to be taken for granted that the more connected, more popular people should be at the center. So centrality. Constructing in visualization where centrality put the most connected at the center was a choice, and the most disconnected to the periphery was another choice. Then you also had a kind of whole weighing of links and connections. So how long, how often do you contact somebody? How often do you see them? How strong it became a measure of how strong the relationship is. So this is a history, from this point of view, it's a history of power, right? How power, again, elaborates, tries to grasp something that was previously invisible, because classical sociology could grasp the society from the outside. So it was about numbers, it was about average. So here, it's a long history of an attempt to make something much more subtle visible, to visualize it, which then became incorporated into social media assemblage or machines, and became a widespread vocabulary of networking, social networkings. So now everything has become this kind of social network thing. So when I heard you, I could imagine you dealing with social networks of powerful people, commissioners who know each other, right? And then if you want to have a project started, you have to put together your own network. You have to kind of, all these things are done, to use a term that has become fashionable in new media studies now, non-conscious, this kind of non-conscious choices or cooperation, they call it. So in a non-conscious way, who should I go? How do social networks form? right? How do I choose which people I'm going to ask to come and collaborate with me? So all of a sudden, it's like social networks everywhere. It's social networks of power and social networks of production. The 2000s also started a trend which I wanted to talk originally about, and it's a social network theory of value, but I thought maybe this was a bit more relevant right now. So the social network has become a kind of the condition of our production, a mode of production. We produced in this way, and this is not new, by assembling networks, and we are ruled by networks. So the interest now is to see whether you can do something different with it, whether this diagram, whether this dispositive, you know, how can you use it to elaborate the kind of politics that you're interested here, freelance politics. Traditionally, the political approach to social networks, which we find in the artwork of Mark Lombardi and Brian Holmes, has been to use the social network to do cognitive mapping. Right? So you use the social network to cognitively map power structures, directorships, you know, who's sitting on which board, how many people are sitting on the same board. You know, you make matrices and then you visualize it. And this was supposed to give the subalternate subjects some way to map the totality of power. And I don't think it worked, as, you know, again, Antonio, in the sense that he lacked a subject that could take on the visualization of power structures and do something about it. Although partially, it would be maybe too much to say it was a failure. When we were talking about boycotting yesterday, I figured that a lot of boycotting is about also teasing out the invisible networks through which people, certain people come to occupy positions of power and get certain commissions. So it's actually quite useful. What is less explored, I think, is that what do you do when you actually form your own social network? What does it mean for you to form a network? I think that this kind of practice that we all engage is become flattened on kind of the technology. So connect, you know. But for human individual organisms, as Radcliffe Brown called them, when individual organisms connect, it's not the same thing as when computers connect, right? It's a different process. Computers connect through protocols. Maybe they're creating, there is a common space of reasoning for machines. That much we know. You know, it's made with protocol, you know, they managed to talk to each other in spite of their huge differences, and that was the spirit of internet working. But a social network to form needs something else. And in this sense, this kind of history of visualizing the invisible, which is how social network theorists try to operate, can tell us something. You know, they tell us, if you read them against the grain, you find the social networks formed through gestures. So think about a baby looking at each other. I'm thinking about the black women of Old Town, which were studied in one of these works, going and visiting each other, or attending the same social events, or caring for each other, even washing up together, the act of washing up at the same time. It's a kind of synchron. There's another term in social network analysis for that. It's synchronization, right? So social networks are formed through gestures, are formed in reciprocity or asymmetry, most often in asymmetry rather than reciprocity. They are figures of entanglement. You know, all these gestures are like spinning webs that hold us together, and some of the gestures are not, you know, the gestures that people could do 100 years ago. These gestures are also following on Twitter, on Facebook, emailing, messaging, calling, all kind of techno-social gestures which are constituting social networks today. So, and also what it's, some of these gestures, such as speaking or writing, involve the articulation of beliefs, desires. You know, these are what become quantities in social network analysis. 2 minutes. That's great because I just finished. You know, I'm almost finished. So, you know, I think that there is a space, you know, thinking about how precarious labor, of which freelancers are a part, could kind of take this on and turn it into something that helps them to resist, in the sense that we were talking yesterday, resisting as increasing your capacity to resist, Howard Kagel's definition, resisting as accumulating strength, you know, getting your networks to grow stronger. You can engage, I mean, you need to engage with this level, with how a social network is formed out of gestures, some of which are technical, how it's formed out of entanglements, how also it includes central figures and peripheral figures. What does it mean to reconstruct, you know, to be in a peripheral or a central position? What does it mean for connections to be cut, as with a kind of Arab artist not being able to make the gesture of crossing the border and actually entering a museum in Palestine. So this is the input I wanted to give you. And for the rest, if you want, you can read Platform Capitalism and the Government of the Social, where I basically put across what I think that is the Facebook is kind of, the Zuckerberg in particular is becoming a political figure to all effects, and they're getting ready for the kind of post-neoliberal mode of government of the social in ways that you can read about if you visit the website. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much
for listening to me. That's good, Cindy, I'm in time. Yeah. Thank you.
I think because of the time and also because of the nature of the talk, which is extremely accessible, and I appreciate that very much, particularly as we mentioned yesterday, with inviting people from other fields to be able to communicate across the divides, let's say. I just wanted you to maybe go a little bit into what you mentioned that you were planning to talk on, but that you didn't, because now you've described a kind of a social network, how they're formed, there is a genealogy there. But can you also just briefly make the leap into maybe something that you have been writing about extensively, which is the capitalization of the network? And also when you do that to a social network, which is, I guess, a realization that it's what we might be doing in a field of curatorial practice where there might not be capital.
It was a different paper. I'm sorry if you expected
that. I didn't. No,
I kind
not
of
at all.
Reacted to what I heard yesterday, where the question of value was not.
Not at all. This is just to be able to expand on your thinking for everyone who's not
okay,
familiar.
That's going to require extreme synthesis.
Please.
Most theories of social network production presuppose a kind of invisible hand that allows people, when they kind of get socially together, to somehow self-organize and produce value. You find that in theories of social production. And also in Marxism sometimes. There is an assumption that social cooperation is kind of automatic. You know, it doesn't need to be looked at specifically much more. I think that I followed very much Maurizio Lazzarato's work on TARD, in La Puissance et l'Invention, and I've become convinced that he's right about that, in social production, value, the production of economic value, or monetary value, or exchangeable value, depends on the mobilization of social values. So social values, which could be aesthetic values, which could be ethical values, which could be truth values, are the engine of social cooperation, because it has become a voluntary thing. It's no longer, the norms are no longer simply imposed. Maybe there is a framework, but what people are looking for, what social production produces, is aesthetic values, again, ethical values, truth values, and it produces that in social networks. What does it mean to say that aesthetic values are produced in social networks? We can look at that from the perspective of social media platforms. They know, you know, what is valued aesthetically in social media, because they got the numbers. They got the big quantities. So the aesthetics of memes, of meme factories, and they know how to monetize that, right? Because they can see the numbers of shares, of likes. They're working on large quantities. They're working on populations. That's why I think they're ready for government, almost ready for government to make that leap. So from our side, how do we become conscious that cooperation in social networks involves the mobilization of this kind of what Moreno called psychological currencies, currents. The psychological currents are about the circulation of beliefs, you know, what we believe is the point of doing a project, what are stakes in it, what do we believe is true, what do we believe is beautiful, what do we believe is right, become something that circulates between the individual organisms that participate in social cooperation. So that's why, in spite of the fact that sometimes it's really kind of a bit annoying to deal with a cryptocurrency community, because of the kind of the constitutionally male constitution, that's why I become interested in this, also these opportunities. Because I think that once production of value becomes more and more dependent, as in freelance networks of curators, or becomes more and more dependent on the social values, then the leap in the translation from social values into currencies, which can be used to ensure some kind of protection from poverty, homelessness, starvation, which I think is the case for a lot of kind of precarious laborers, maybe can be devised. It's not going to be peaceful, because we've seen that we are talking before about the smart cooperative. I don't have the time to talk about it now. It's not going to be peaceful because it's going to be a lot of, the legislation is going to be passed to stop these kind of things, to make them illegal. But I think it's a weak point of the structure. You know, the kind of the economic development is showing us more and more that all kinds of labor, even labor that we deem menial, right? We talk about menial and immaterial labor, is still a social component of valorization, and that the leap from that to the creation of abstract currencies is an interesting space, or platforms of some kind.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, finally I get to hold on. Okay. So, first of all, this was just brilliant, as always, from Tiziana. I wouldn't expect anything less. It's so rich, and I'm obviously enjoying the fact that it resonates so much with what I was saying.
Yes, yeah.
I think it's kind of, I don't know whether I would call it symptomatic, but I think it's interesting in any case that what you imply, I guess also in resonance to Bassam's invocation of the common space of reasoning, that basically that computers and computer protocols create that common space of reasoning for computational reasoning, if you want, right? Yeah. Which also implies to me that you know, to think about the space of reasoning as a common task, we have to share the idea of some kind of common self, right? Something that we can agree as to be the subject of that reasoning, which is, I guess, something to be discussed further, maybe with Bassam. But that reminded me of, you know, some of the early works by Bruno Latour, who is now being a favorite target of many, which to some extent I can also join. But, you know, his distinction between the complex and complicated, right? And here I come to agonism and agonistic space and so on. The complicated, computer protocols are complicated, and computer forms of computational reason, so to say, is complicated. But in Latour's differentiation, it certainly would not be complex. A conversation in a bar is complex, right? And this is something where we come to the limits of artificial intelligence. But I also it's just kind of a series of associations that I'm offering maybe for discussion rather than a question. Thinking about similarly to what happened with Facebook, perhaps, I'm reminded of how, one of the kind of Google corporate statement before 2005 is that Google wants to be this kind of serve as the universal archive, the archive of universal knowledge.
The mission statements of these companies.
Exactly. So, and at that time they still had all of these projects like that were making this universal archive, so to say, accessible. This is going to sound a little bit like a conspiracy theory, but it's interesting to me that the moment that Ray Kurzweil joins Google, all of this archive becomes basically a private archive for the extraction of value. So they're not publicly accessible anymore. The archive still exists, but it's just placed into the service of developing artificial intelligence and so on. So it's kind of interesting to think about these things, I guess, in relation to what you're saying. And a final point is that, so here I come back to what the interesting slip that we heard from Vivian yesterday when she said, we turn into human capital. And I think it is interesting how this kind of universal humanist attempt to create the universal archive basically turns into the archive or kind of repository of human capital. Yeah? Yeah, and then just the final note in terms of the community, the global community and so on, and in terms of what you mentioned, the kind of the hysteria that caused the factory to close, I'm reminded of something that was termed by a Yugoslav psychoanalyst a partisan hysteria, which is an interesting phenomena that when after the, after the war, after the kind of guerrilla revolutionary struggle in ex-Yugoslavia, the new hospitals were formed and so on, and they were trying to separate, based on gender, women partisans from men partisans, and they would not separate. They would just be completely going nuts about this separation, which I think is an interesting point as well in terms of, thinking about perhaps in a kind of, the line of thinking of, all of this beautiful French theory that is now slightly also discarded and forgotten, and kind of partly embarrassing, Blanchot and Nancy and so on, but more importantly, Bataille, and when Bataille says community of those, for me, the community is only the community of those without the community. That is the radical anti-essentialism in that project, right? So, that's where we, I guess we're going against the grain of this universal archive, which is basically the repository of human capital, right?
Yeah. Do you have a response at all?
I have an addition. Interesting. Well, another thing that I keep going back to is Foucault, reconstruction of civil society, the idea of civil society in Adam Ferguson, less Adam Smith, more Adam Ferguson. And the idea that civil society, first of all, it's Facebook that has become all about community. There was a Facebook community meeting in Chicago a few months ago, and now there's going to be one in Europe, I think in Germany, where they kind of get all these community leaders, they call them, which are the admins of the Facebook groups, and to show, all these beautiful things that they are doing. But I remember what Adam Ferguson said about civil society. That it was communitarian, not humanitarian, which in civil society is exclusionary. It's about people are like me and people are not like me. People who, if something bad happens to them, either I don't care or I'm glad. That's a structure of civil society. And I think kind of Facebook has got a little bit of that. More than a little bit of that built into it. So communities always have this dark side.
Before we move to next, we have one question. Bruno Latour is speaking in this room in 2 days, right? Yeah. Just a note.
Pro nature.
Right?
Who's speaking?
Yeah, he's coming. Just a note. Sorry? It's a live stream as well. Vivian had a question?
I know that
which I think maybe is the last.
No, I think certainly I shouldn't be the last voice. There's at least 2 or 3 other questions.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm sorry to be taking the microphone again when I know I'm hosting, but I have a burning question, to be honest, which is that, okay, so something I was reflecting on last night before I went to bed after all of the conversations and everything spinning in my head, right, is a bit of a difference, or the need to sort of qualify within the real conversations that we're having about labor and remuneration, right? The question of work. So something that I was reflecting upon, so if we're moving towards a social network theory of value, which is certainly how financial capital is harvesting like mad, right? Leaving many of the industrialists behind even, of the 20th century style, manufacturing. Yes. So I find working with Anna, right, on this, that the work is no problem. We can work, we agree on things before we've even spoken it to each other. Getting the work done is actually a pleasure, and there's enough time for it, right? But as a freelancer, I find the thing is actually when I hit the need for effort. When I have to explain to a large institution over and over and over and over and over again why it needs to be done a certain way or not done a certain way, when I need to explain that to a funding body, when I need to deal with the extremely legitimate demands of communities or artists that I can't adequately respond to because of the institutional agreements that I've formed in order to host the project.
The protocols.
Whatever it is that I would somehow differentiate work from effort, and it's in effort that an enormous, is where the exhaustive part of freelance labor is as I experience it. And where the value, remuneration, hours, money question collapses. So I'd love, I don't know if there's research or something.
My friends and comrades of the cognitive capitalism kind of thesis, which I have some agreements and some differences with, but also Tony Negri and Michael Hart, they keep referring to this kind of affective labor. The term cognitive labor was contested for not having enough of that, so it's all biocognitive labor. So within this kind of Marxist theory, which I'm close to, what you describe of is the exhaustion of affective labor. It's not about communication. The communication, translation are all dependent on the fact that you have to somehow create a bond, even temporary, with the people you are connected to. And the bond is not just about convincing them rationally, because the belief, the beliefs, the desires, come into it. So you're drained by that process, which is part of the thesis about the feminization of labor in social production that some feminists disagree with. I think Silvia Federici does not see that as a useful concept. The fact that all the work of dealing with the affective composition of the family, holding it together, and familiar networks, which has always been women's work. Women's work has been to kind of keep the family's network together. It's become a core economic activity, and it's not by chance that's the time that it's not paid, or it's not accountable. It's not accounted, where the measure kind of collapses, they would say.
And I'd say it's not by chance that, without intending to, Anna and I vastly invited women to this program more than men. No, I mean, in terms of freelance labor, there's vastly more women doing this work as curators.
They've been socialized into taking care of relationships.
I believe I saw Ahmed's hand before yours, Rachel and Johan. We're not going to have lunch today.
None of you is a good catcher. I've been watching you. Everybody's kind of getting it in all kinds of positions. All right.
Okay.
Probably I'm not a good catcher either. So
thanks. I really enjoyed the talk. I'd like to chat to you a little bit at some point about the work you're doing around value. Just maybe 2 quick points. Maybe not that quick. But indie media, I don't know if you remember the kind of platform. I think they still exist in some places and so on. But they emerged in 1999 on the kind of back of the Seattle mobilization on PHP-based systems. that were kind of user-generated content. And it strikes me that, I mean, I come from a place that we had really shit internet connection at the time. So, I mean, I might be getting this wrong, but it did seem to me that indie media kind of preceded the Web 2.0 kind of coinage and so on, and that it actually kind of developed forms of social media, and some of the kind of graphs that you were showing. I mean, the first time I saw those kinds of representations was in representations of the global indie media network.
Right.
Now, I'm just curious if you have any sense of what the significance of that is, that a kind of, before the kind of big push of capital towards the kind of Web 2.0 value production, kind of, there was something actually happening on the left that in many ways developed some of the kind of early technology that then was redeployed by news sites and so on. So the first news feed, that kind of immediate, kind of real-time news feed, but kind of user content that I came across was indie media.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
So maybe just what the implications of that is. And then the kind of second thing I wanted to kind of ask about, I mean, as an old, Hart and Negri have written so much since Empire, but one of the kind of key arguments that they make in Empire that kind of seems to, they've kept it, but they don't kind of frame it in the same way, was that contemporary forms of capitalism are based on the appropriation of value outside of the wage relationship, often in the form of the ways in which they appropriate the human networks that we create and so on. And then they go on and they make a further claim that I kind of agree with that, and they kind of associate that with a kind of form of primitive accumulation, right? Where I'd like to kind of get your sense of what you think of this, is then they make the claim that as capitalism kind of appropriates the forms of networks that we create, that the ways in which, to the extent that they need to kind of appropriate the forms of cooperation that kind of organically emerge, means that capital in itself is then transformed in this process. So we almost have like a kind of rejig of the capitalism kind of inventing its own gravediggers kind of argument, but here, in that actual act of appropriation of this value produced outside of the wage relationship.
Yeah, that's a thesis, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I just was curious.
I'll start from the last, basically they've been, Tony Negri has been insisting, and the whole post-autonomist milieu, apart from Bifo, who's following his online, that the rise of this kind of labor, social cooperation, precarious labor, indicates the potential autonomy of labor, and they haven't moved from that. But I think it's a bit different that capitalism digging its own graveyard, because it's a potential, it's an autonomy which is not just potential, it's real. We know how to produce. We know how to assemble our networks. We know how to get things done. Remember when we occupied the University of East London, it was a genial occupation because they just occupied the admin offices, and they showed that the university can run very efficiently without them, without the managers. You really don't need them. But at the same time, they're also saying that this development has been matched by reorganization of capitalism. And the financialization, extractivism, has become, are the means through which this kind of hold, this control, which is what you need to have in order to extract value, to monetize this effort at some level. So they think it's moved to financialization as a new forms of extractivism, and which requires a political answer. And there, it's where, assembly now, it's the work of social movements, of organization, to trying to figure out how you match so that control. That's why there's interest in new financial instruments, because if you are potentially capable to organize production, and you don't need managers to tell you what to do, then what the managers do is regulate the flow of money that you need. So if you find a way to kind of establish the autonomy, although autonomy, I think, again, should be challenged as a concept. If we move from autopoiesis to social cybernetic, the auto is to be challenged. Then you have the possibility of freeing yourself from this auto, which is not going to be a peaceful process. But in the media, yes. My friends who were in the media say that the kind of whole thing collapsed after social media. Social media had been made also bits and pieces which were invented before. So this kind of independent area, they absolutely assembled, and then they brought their own thing with the social network in it. And I remember being in meetings where kind of non-academic, like members of the business community were present, and they, more like a philanthropic entrepreneur, let's say. And they recounted that the investors' financial market sank so much capital into these companies, Facebook and so on, are kind of basically allowing them to go on with losses for such a long time because they had the political stakes in that kind of technology, winning over the kind of open source, free software models which were being developed around the same time. So without a massive cash investment, they wouldn't have been able to gain the network effects that you need to operate in this context.
Thank you so much. I'm sure you're going to have a lot to talk about. I'm going to take a, no, we're going to, sorry. Because there is lots of conversation to be had also over lunch, but also there needs to be time to dance a little bit. There is a request from Erika and Hernan that particularly the men in the room show up for a salsa lesson during lunch. But then I would extend that to everyone who's interested to move a little bit after sitting still for such a long time. Lunch is downstairs like yesterday. You're all welcome back at 3 o'clock. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me.